How did a stray dog move through ruined streets more safely than trained resistance couriers who knew every shadow and checkpoint in occupied France? Why was Ghost drawn again and again to the same destroyed alley in a district reduced to rubble? And what did he find there that no human had noticed? What message could be so important that fighters hiding from the Gestapo would trust their survival to an animal that appeared from nowhere and answered to no one? In the autumn of 1943, those questions had life or death significance for the 7 members of the Relied resistance cell who occupied the ruins of what had once been the Saint-Michel district in northern France. German artillery had reduced the neighborhood to skeletal buildings and mountains of broken masonry during fighting 2 years earlier, and the occupation authorities had never bothered rebuilding what they considered strategically worthless rubble. That neglect made it perfect for resistance operations, until 3 successive German raids in September shattered the regional networks and forced survivors underground in conditions where underground meant literal cellars beneath collapsed structures that offered concealment at the cost of becoming potential tombs. The cell's leader, Marcel Dubois, had been coordinating resistance activities in this sector for 18 months before the raids forced him into these ruins with 6 others, 3 men and 3 women, whose real names he knew but never used in operational discussion. They called themselves by code names that changed monthly, a security measure that felt increasingly futile as German counterintelligence grew more sophisticated and informants more numerous. The safe houses they'd relied on were compromised. The courier networks that had connected scattered resistance groups were broken. Radio contact was impossible. The Germans had direction-finding equipment that could locate transmitters within minutes of activation. They were trapped in roughly 3 square blocks of devastation, surrounded by German patrols that had intensified since the raids, cut off from the remaining resistance networks they knew existed somewhere in the city, but couldn't reach without exposing themselves to capture. Food was down to whatever could be scavenged from abandoned buildings that had already been picked over by desperate civilians. Ammunition was 12 rounds total among 3 weapons. Medical supplies consisted of bandages torn from clothing and iodine that had probably lost its potency months ago. The first time Ghost appeared was on a night when Marcel was considering the mathematics of surrender versus fighting to the death versus attempting a breakout that would probably end in massacre. The dog materialized from darkness between collapsed walls, a German Shepherd mix that was thin enough to show ribs but moved with surprising energy for an animal that should have been starving. His coat was matted with dust and debris. One ear was torn from some past injury, and his eyes showed the wariness of a creature that had learned to trust nothing and no one. Sophie Marchand, the cell's youngest member at 19, was the first to notice him. She'd been on watch in what remained of a 3rd-floor apartment when the dog appeared in the street below, picking his way through rubble with the careful steps of an animal that understood urban ruins held hidden dangers. She watched him pause at intersections, testing the air before proceeding, avoiding areas where debris looked unstable. His movement pattern wasn't random scavenging. It was purposeful navigation, suggesting he had a destination and knew how to reach it. The dog disappeared into what had been a pharmacy. Its front wall collapsed, but the interior partially intact behind fallen masonry that created a cave-like entrance. Sophie lost visual contact for perhaps 10 minutes, then saw him emerge carrying something in his mouth. Through the binoculars she'd salvaged from a dead German officer 2 months earlier, she could see it was fabric. Clothing maybe, or canvas, gripped carefully between teeth that weren't crushing or tearing the material. The dog moved away into darkness, heading northeast toward the sector where German patrols were most active, and vanished as completely as he'd appeared. She reported the observation to Marcel with the uncertainty of someone who knew that in occupied France, anything unusual might be German deception designed to identify resistance positions. Dogs could be trained to track specific scents, to locate hidden people, to lead handlers to targets that evaded conventional search methods. But this dog had shown no interest in their hiding place, had moved through the district without investigating the cellar entrance they used, and had carried whatever he'd found away from their position rather than toward it. The dog returned the following night, same approximate time, same careful movement pattern through ruins that would challenge human navigation in darkness. This time, Marie-Laurent was on watch, and she observed the same behavior Sophie had reported: purposeful travel to the destroyed pharmacy, time spent inside that structure, emergence carrying fabric or paper, departure toward German-controlled sectors. The pattern repeated for 4 consecutive nights, each observation adding detail to a picture that made no tactical sense, until the night ghost carried his prize close enough to their position that Marie could see it clearly through binoculars. It was a message pouch. Not German military issue, but the kind resistance couriers used. Waterproofed canvas with internal pockets designed to protect coded documents from weather and rough handling. The dog was carrying resistance material, which meant he was finding it somewhere in these ruins and transporting it somewhere else, for reasons that defied any explanation except the one nobody wanted to voice. Somehow this animal had learned to recognize resistance materials and was collecting them. Marcel made the decision to intercept the dog the next time he appeared, a choice that balanced operational security against the desperate need for any information about what had happened to the networks the German raids had destroyed. If this dog was finding resistance materials, those materials might contain intelligence about other survivors, about German operations, about anything that could help 7 trapped fighters understand their situation beyond the 3 blocks of rubble they could directly observe. The interception happened on the 6th night of Ghost's appearances. Antoine Rousseau, the cell's best field operative, positioned himself along the route they'd mapped from previous observations and waited with the infinite patience that kept resistance fighters alive in occupied territory. When Ghost approached, Antoine didn't try to grab him. That would trigger flight response in an animal that had learned caution meant survival. Instead, he offered food. A piece of dried sausage that represented a significant sacrifice from their dwindling supplies, but might buy cooperation from a dog that was clearly underfed. Ghost stopped, evaluated the offering and the human presenting it, and made a decision that suggested intelligence beyond normal canine capability. He approached, accepted the food, and allowed Antoine to examine what he carried. The message pouch contained fragments of coded communication, partial documents that had been torn or damaged, probably during the German raids when couriers were killed or forced to destroy materials before capture. The pieces meant nothing individually, but they confirmed that somewhere in this devastated district, resistance materials were scattered among the ruins, overlooked by German searchers, but found by an animal whose survival depended on investigating anything that might be food or shelter. Marcel studied the fragments by candlelight that barely illuminated the cellar where they huddled against October cold that penetrated clothing and stone with equal efficiency. The codes were standard resistance cipher, nothing sophisticated enough to resist German cryptanalysis if captured intact, but sufficient to protect information from casual observation. Most of the fragments were too damaged to decode, but one piece contained enough intact text to reveal something that made Marcel's chest tighten with professional dread. It was dated September 28th, 4 days ago, and referenced a planned purge operation in sectors that included their current location. If this story has captured your attention, if you're wondering whether Ghost will become the cell's lifeline or lead the Gestapo straight to them, make sure you subscribe to follow this tale of survival in occupied France. Drop a comment with your thoughts on the unlikely partnerships that emerged during the resistance. Hit that like button, and share this with anyone who appreciates authentic W2 history that honors the courage of those who fought from the shadows. The next chapters will reveal what Ghost discovered in those ruins, and whether trusting a stray dog was desperation or the only choice that could save them. Marcel convened the cell in the deepest section of their cellar hideout, where stone walls muffled sound enough that whispered conversation wouldn't carry to street level. The fragment Ghost had delivered mentioned a purge operation, but without complete context, they couldn't determine timing, scope, or whether it targeted this specific district or broader areas. The uncertainty was almost worse than confirmed danger. It meant every hour might be their last, or they might have days before German forces tightened the noose. Sophie proposed the plan that Marcel had been formulating, but hadn't wanted to voice first. We follow the dog, see where he's finding these materials. If there's a cache of resistance documents in these ruins, we need to recover them before Germans do. And if Ghost is collecting them systematically, he'll lead us directly to the source. Her logic was sound, but the risks were substantial. Following the dog meant exposing themselves to observation, moving through territory they hadn't fully mapped, and potentially walking into German patrols that were increasing nightly sweeps through the district. Antoine volunteered for the reconnaissance, arguing that his experience in field operations made him best suited for shadowing an animal through urban ruins without being detected by either the dog or enemy forces. Marcel approved with the stipulation that Marie would provide overwatch from elevated positions, ready to signal warning if German patrols approached the route Antoine followed. It was minimal security, but their limited numbers meant every operation was undermanned by doctrine standards that assumed resources they no longer possessed. Ghost appeared the following night with the punctuality that suggested either routine or instinct. Antoine was positioned along the dog's usual route, far enough back that his presence wouldn't be immediately obvious, but close enough to maintain visual contact in darkness broken only by distant streetlights that German authorities kept functioning in occupied sectors. The dog moved with his characteristic caution, pausing frequently to test the environment through senses that detected threats Antoine couldn't perceive. The destination was farther than previous observations had suggested. Ghost traveled nearly half a mile through ruins that grew progressively more devastated as they moved toward what had been the district's commercial center. Here, German artillery had been particularly thorough, reducing buildings to foundations and scattered walls that rose from rubble like broken teeth. Antoine moved carefully, aware that unstable structures could collapse without warning, and that noise would carry in the peculiar acoustics of destroyed urban spaces. Ghost stopped at what remained of a 4-story apartment building, its facade mostly gone but interior walls still standing in a configuration that created protected spaces invisible from street level. The dog squeezed through a gap between fallen beams, disappearing into darkness that Antoine couldn't penetrate without artificial light he didn't dare use. For 15 minutes Antoine waited, watching approaches for German patrols while listening for sounds that might indicate what Ghost was doing inside the ruins. When the dog emerged, he carried a leather satchel, larger than previous finds, intact rather than fragmented, the kind of courier bag that would have contained multiple documents or materials too valuable to risk in simple message pouches. Ghost moved away from the building with his usual careful navigation, but this time he didn't head toward German sectors. Instead, he turned back toward the area where the resistance cell was hidden, as if he'd decided that whatever he'd found belonged with the humans who'd been feeding him. Antoine followed at increased distance, not wanting to spook the dog now that Ghost seemed to be delivering materials directly to them rather than carrying them elsewhere. Marie spotted them both from her overwatch position and signaled Marcel that Antoine was returning with the dog and significant cargo. The cell assembled near their entrance point, weapons ready despite knowing that if this was German deception, fighting would only delay the inevitable rather than prevent it. Ghost approached their position without hesitation, dropped the satchel at Marcel's feet, and sat expectantly, behavior that suggested either previous training or remarkable intelligence that allowed the animal to understand human needs. Marcel examined the satchel carefully before opening it, checking for German markings or anything that indicated this might be bait in a trap, designed to identify resistance positions. The leather showed wear consistent with months of use, staining that could be water damage or blood, and closure mechanisms that were standard resistance issue rather than German military equipment. Inside were documents that made Marcel's hands shake as he recognized what Ghost had found. They were operational orders from the Regional Resistance Command, dated from before the September raids, containing information about network structures, safe houses, courier routes, and, most critically, alternate communication protocols to be used if primary networks were compromised. This was exactly what they needed to re-establish contact with other survivors, assuming any other cells had managed to evade the German purge. But the documents also contained something more immediate and terrifying. Tucked among the operational orders was a recent German directive, probably captured from an officer killed during the raids, detailing the purge operation the earlier fragment had referenced. The operation was scheduled to begin in 48 hours, would involve house-to-house searches of every structure in a 12-block area that included their current position, and would be conducted by Gestapo units specifically trained in detecting hidden resistance members. The Germans weren't planning to kill them in combat. They were planning to dig them out of whatever holes they'd crawled into and extract information before execution. Sophie studied the German document with the language skills that made her invaluable for intelligence work. This mentions a new observer, Sturmbannführer Kessler, arriving from Berlin specifically to oversee the operation. He's Gestapo counterintelligence, specializes in breaking resistance networks through systematic interrogation and informant cultivation. If he's here, it means they know we exist and are close to finding us. The tactical situation had shifted from uncertain danger to confirmed crisis. They had 48 hours before systematic searches would inevitably discover their hiding place. The documents Ghost had delivered provided the means to contact other resistance cells and warn them about the purge, but transmitting that warning would require getting a courier through German lines to reach the nearest confirmed safe zone, roughly 3 miles away through occupied streets where checkpoints and patrols made daytime movement suicidal and nighttime travel only marginally less dangerous. Marcel made the assessment every member of the cell was simultaneously reaching. We can't send a human courier. Anyone we send will be caught, and when they're caught, they'll be interrogated. Gestapo methods are effective enough that even our best people would break eventually. He looked at Ghost, who was accepting food from Sophie with the calm demeanor of a dog that had no concept of the life and death calculations happening around him. But an animal moving through rubble wouldn't attract attention. Germans see stray dogs constantly in occupied zones. They're background noise, beneath notice unless they're causing problems. Antoine voiced what they were all thinking. We can train him to carry a message to a specific location. It's not conventional courier work, but nothing about this situation is conventional. The question is whether we can make him understand the destination, and whether he'll actually go there instead of just wandering randomly through ruins. Training Ghost to carry a message to a specific location required methodology the resistance cell had never developed because their operational doctrine had never anticipated using animals for courier work. Sophie took the lead, drawing on childhood memories of training farm dogs and improvising techniques that might translate to making a stray understand complex instructions. The challenge wasn't teaching Ghost to carry something. He'd already demonstrated that capability. The challenge was directing him to a specific destination he'd never visited, while ensuring he didn't simply wander back to wherever he'd been taking previous finds. They started with scent association. The message needed to reach a bookstore in the Saint-Lazare quarter, 3 miles northeast, where the owner was a confirmed resistance sympathizer who maintained contact with surviving networks. Antoine had a scarf belonging to the bookstore owner, taken months earlier during a coordination meeting. The theory was that Ghost could follow that scent to its source if properly motivated and guided through initial stages of the route. The training consumed 12 hours they could barely spare. Sophie worked with Ghost in the cellar, rewarding him with food scraps when he showed interest in the scarf, gradually increasing the distance he had to travel to locate it when Antoine hid it in different sections of their hiding place. The dog learned quickly, displaying intelligence that suggested either previous training or natural aptitude that made him unusually responsive to human instruction. By evening, Ghost could reliably locate the scarf anywhere within their limited territory. The real test would be extending that behavior beyond familiar ruins into occupied streets where German patrols, checkpoints, and informants made every block potentially fatal. Marcel prepared the message with extreme care, using code that would be meaningless to German cryptanalysis if intercepted, but clear to resistance members who possessed the cipher keys. The warning was concise. Purge operation imminent, 12-block sweep. Gestapo counterintelligence directing. All cells in sector must evacuate or go to ground deeper than current positions allow. They packaged the message in a small waterproof pouch attached to a collar fashioned from canvas strips. Ghost tolerated the collar after initial resistance, apparently accepting it as the price for continued food access. The collar was designed to be inconspicuous. A stray wearing a collar wasn't unusual enough to warrant attention, and the attached pouch was small enough to be mistaken for identification tags if noticed at all. Marie raised the concern that had been troubling everyone. What if he doesn't go to the bookstore? What if he just returns to wherever he was taking things before we intercepted him? We're trusting survival to behavior we've observed for barely a week. Her skepticism was valid, but Marcel had already made the calculation that doing nothing guaranteed failure while attempting this unlikely courier method at least offered possibility of success. The departure was scheduled for 200 hours. When German patrols changed shifts and brief gaps appeared in coverage patterns the cell had mapped through weeks of observation. Antoine would guide Ghost through the initial quarter mile, using the scent scarf to keep him oriented toward the correct direction, then release him to navigate the remaining distance independently. It was improvisation built on hope rather than tested doctrine, but resistance operations often succeeded or failed based on exactly that kind of desperate creativity. Antoine and Ghost moved into darkness that was absolute between the widely spaced streetlights German authorities maintained in occupied zones. The dog followed the scent trail Sophie had established, moving with purpose that suggested he understood this was different from his usual wandering through ruins. Antoine maintained minimal contact, not wanting to influence the dog's navigation, but ready to intervene if Ghost showed signs of heading in wrong directions. They reached the edge of relatively safe territory, at a checkpoint the Germans had established where rubble zone met occupied residential streets. Two soldiers stood visible in lamplight, checking papers of the few civilians who had legitimate reasons for nighttime movement. Antoine couldn't go further without certain detection. This was where Ghost would either prove Sophie's training effective or reveal that they'd gambled everything on an animal that didn't understand what they needed. Antoine removed the scent scarf from his pocket, let Ghost smell it thoroughly, then pointed in the direction where the bookstore lay beyond German lines. "Go," he whispered, using the command Sophie had established during training. "Find it." The words probably meant nothing to the dog, but the gesture and tone conveyed intention that Ghost seemed to grasp. The dog looked at Antoine, looked toward the checkpoint, then began moving with the careful stealth that had kept him alive in occupied territory, where stray animals were often shot for creating noise or disruption. Ghost approached the checkpoint from an angle that kept him in shadows, moving when the guards were distracted by legitimate foot traffic, freezing when their attention swept the surrounding area. He passed within 10 yards of German soldiers who never looked down, never noticed the medium-sized dog that might as well have been invisible for all the attention he attracted. Beyond the checkpoint, Ghost disappeared into streets that Antoine couldn't observe without exposing himself to detection. Antoine returned to the cell with the report that Ghost had successfully navigated past the first major obstacle. But whether he'd continue toward the bookstore or simply wander until the message was lost remained unknown. They would know within hours if the plan succeeded. Either the bookstore owner would initiate contact protocols indicating message received, or morning would come with no response, and the knowledge that their warning had failed to reach anyone who could act on it. The waiting was worse than action. Marcel posted watches, but there was nothing to observe, except the slow passage of time measured in heartbeats and distant sounds of German patrols conducting their endless security operations. Sophie tried to sleep and couldn't, her mind running through everything that might go wrong with Ghost's journey. Marie cleaned weapons that were already immaculate, because activity was better than sitting in darkness contemplating failure. Antoine studied maps they'd drawn of the district, looking for evacuation routes they might use when the Gestapo sweep began, and their current hiding place became untenable. Dawn arrived with the gray light that characterized October mornings in northern France, cold enough to make breath visible, but not cold enough yet for the killing frosts that would come in weeks. No response had arrived from the bookstore. No indication that Ghost had reached his destination, or that the message had been received by anyone capable of acting on it. The silence might mean failure, or it might mean success with response delayed by operational security that prevented immediate acknowledgement. They wouldn't know which until time revealed outcomes that were currently hidden behind the fog of uncertainty that defined resistance operations in occupied territory. The second night brought increased German activity that suggested their timeline was compressing faster than the captured documents had indicated. Marcel observed from their highest vantage point as trucks moved through streets that had been relatively quiet for weeks, depositing soldiers at intervals that looked suspiciously like preparation for systematic search operations. The Gestapo observer had apparently arrived ahead of schedule, or the purge operation had been accelerated for reasons the resistance couldn't determine from their isolated position. Sophie counted vehicle movements and troop deployments, creating a tactical picture that confirmed their worst assessment. They're establishing a cordon, not just checkpoints but continuous coverage designed to prevent anyone from slipping through gaps. This is preparation for a sweep that assumes targets will try to run when pressure increases. Her analysis was grimly accurate. German counterinsurgency doctrine emphasized containment before extraction, ensuring that when searches began, resistance members had nowhere to flee. The cell made preparations for evacuation they knew would probably fail, but couldn't avoid attempting. They cached weapons in locations that might be recoverable if they survived the initial sweep. Documents were burned, their ashes scattered so thoroughly that no forensic analysis could reconstruct content. Personal items that might identify them to Gestapo interrogators were destroyed or hidden in ways that made discovery unlikely, but not impossible. Each member wrote final messages to family they would probably never see again. Letters that Marie would attempt to deliver if she alone survived whatever was coming. At 2100 hours, Antoine spotted movement in the ruins, a dog-shaped shadow navigating through rubble with the caution they'd learned to recognize as Ghost's characteristic approach pattern. The animal emerged into the dim light of their observation position carrying nothing visible, which might mean he'd successfully delivered the message, or might mean he'd lost it somewhere during his journey through occupied streets. He approached their position without the wariness he'd shown initially, apparently having decided these humans were pack rather than threat. Sophie examined Ghost carefully, checking for injuries or signs that he'd encountered problems during the courier run. The dog was exhausted, paws showing abrasions from extended travel over rough surfaces, but otherwise intact. The message pouch was gone from his collar, which suggested either successful delivery or loss during navigation. Without confirmation from the bookstore owner, they couldn't know which scenario had occurred, but Ghost's return at least meant the dog had survived the journey and could potentially be used for additional missions if time permitted. The confirmation came at midnight in a form they hadn't anticipated. A pebble struck the stone wall near their observation post with enough force to be deliberately thrown rather than randomly falling. Marcel signaled for weapons ready while Antoine moved to investigate, finding a small package wrapped in oilcloth wedged into rubble near where the pebble had landed. Inside was a note written in code they recognized, confirmation that the message had been received. Other cells had been warned. Evacuation was proceeding for those who could move, and deeper concealment was being attempted by those who couldn't. But the note contained additional intelligence that changed their tactical calculation. The bookstore owner reported that informant activity had increased dramatically in the past 24 hours, suggesting someone was providing Germans with detailed information about resistance operations. The Gestapo observer, Kessler, was known for cultivating informants through combination of incentives and threats that had proven effective in other occupied territories. If an informant existed within the remaining resistance networks, every message sent could potentially be compromised. Every safe house could become a trap. Marcel gathered the cell for assessment they all knew would determine whether they attempted further communication or accepted isolation as the price of security. Marie argued for continued courier attempts using Ghost, reasoning that the dog couldn't be interrogated if captured and therefore represented the most secure communication method available. Antoine countered that increased German activity made any movement increasingly dangerous, and that each courier run risked exposing Ghost to capture or death that would eliminate their communication capability entirely. The debate was interrupted by sounds that made everyone freeze. Boots on rubble, multiple soldiers, moving through ruins with the systematic progression that indicated search operation rather than routine patrol. The Gestapo sweep had begun 12 hours early, probably because Kessler had intelligence suggesting resistance members were preparing to evacuate and wanted to catch them before they could disperse. The cordon they'd observed being established was now contracting, pushing inward from perimeter to center in a pattern designed to drive targets toward predetermined kill zones or capture points. Ghost's reaction to the approaching soldiers was immediate and instructive. The dog moved to the deepest section of their cellar, positioning himself in shadows where he'd be invisible to casual observation, and went completely still, behavior that suggested he'd learned to hide from German patrols during whatever experiences had made him astray in occupied territory. The cell followed his example, weapons ready, but knowing that firing would only reveal their position and invite overwhelming response from forces they couldn't defeat through combat. The German search team passed within 20 yards of their hiding place, using electric torches to probe spaces where resistance members might shelter. Their search was thorough but not exhaustive. They were covering too much ground too quickly to examine every possible hiding spot with the care that would be required to find well-concealed targets. The cell remained motionless, barely breathing, while Germans moved overhead and around their position for 15 minutes that felt like hours. When the soldiers finally continued their sweep toward other sections of the ruins, everyone exhaled simultaneously in relief that was tempered by knowledge that this was merely the first wave of searches that would continue until either all resistance members were found or German commanders concluded the district was clear. Marcel assessed their remaining options with the clarity that came from having most alternatives eliminated by circumstances beyond control. We can't stay here. Next search wave will be more thorough, probably with dogs and ground-penetrating equipment that will detect our cellar even if we remain silent. We need to move to a position the Germans have already searched, somewhere they won't expect us to hide because they've already cleared it. The logic was sound, but implementation would require moving through ruins that were now occupied by German forces conducting active operations. Sophie proposed using Ghost as forward scout, sending him ahead to detect German positions before the cell moved into potentially occupied areas. The dog had proven capable of navigating occupied territory and avoiding patrols, skills that would be critical for the cell's survival during evacuation to whatever temporary refuge they could reach before the Gestapo cordon became impenetrable. It was another improvisation, another desperate measure that relied on capabilities they discovered by accident rather than planned through careful operational design. Antoine prepared Ghost for the scout mission with techniques adapted from Sophie's earlier training, establishing hand signals that indicated direction and distance while using food rewards to reinforce desired behaviors. The dog learned quickly, responding to gestures with a focus that suggested he understood, or at least accepted, that his role had evolved from message courier to tactical asset. Whether Ghost could actually detect German positions and communicate that information to humans was about to be tested under conditions where failure meant capture or death. Ghost led them through ruins that had transformed into a maze of German positions established during the hours since the sweep began. The dog moved in careful increments, pausing when his posture suggested nearby soldiers, waiting for the cell to recognize his warning before proceeding. Marcel had learned to read Ghost's body language. Ears flat meant immediate danger, tail rigid meant uncertainty, relaxed movement meant the path was temporarily clear. They covered 2 blocks in 3 hours, movement so slow it felt like they were barely advancing. But speed would have meant noise, and noise would have meant discovery. The Germans were thorough, checking spaces their initial sweep had cleared, apparently aware that resistance doctrine included reoccupying recently searched areas. Kessler's influence was evident in the systematic approach. This wasn't routine patrol work, but methodical clearing operation designed by someone who understood how resistance cells operated and adapted. The new hiding position was a partially collapsed warehouse whose interior had burned during the artillery bombardment 2 years earlier. The Germans had searched it in the first wave, spending perhaps 10 minutes examining the ground floor before moving on. The cell now occupied a section of basement accessed through a gap in the floor that was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Ghost had found it during one of his wandering expeditions, leading them to concealment that human searchers would probably miss even during thorough examination. Marie established observation positions that provided limited view of surrounding streets while remaining invisible from ground level. What she saw made clear that German forces were settling in for extended operations rather than conducting quick sweep and withdrawal. They'd established command posts, brought in food and equipment that suggested multi-day commitment, and were coordinating search patterns with communications discipline that indicated professional counterinsurgency rather than conventional military operations. The informant problem became acute when Marie observed a civilian being escorted by Gestapo officers through streets that were supposed to be cleared of non-combatants. The civilian was pointing to specific buildings, apparently providing information about resistance activities or suspected hiding locations. Whether this was the informant mentioned in the bookstore owner's message, or simply one of many collaborators Kessler had cultivated, was unknowable, but the implication was clear. Someone with knowledge of resistance operations was actively assisting German searches. Sophie proposed using Ghost to deliver one final message, this time warning the bookstore owner about the informant threat and requesting guidance on whether evacuation was still possible or whether the cell should attempt to hide until German operations concluded. The risk was substantial. Each courier run increased the chance that Ghost would be noticed, captured, or killed. But the alternative was remaining isolated without intelligence about what was happening beyond their immediate observation range. Marcel approved the mission with modifications based on what they'd learned from Ghost's previous journey. The message would be minimal, a simple warning about informant activity and request for extraction support if available. The route would avoid checkpoints Ghost had navigated before, on theory that German forces might have adjusted security after noticing a stray dog passing through their lines, and Antoine would accompany Ghost for the first mile, providing guidance through the most dangerous sections before releasing him to navigate independently. The departure was scheduled for 0300 hours, during the gap in German patrol patterns they'd identified through careful observation. Ghost wore a modified collar that made the message pouch even less conspicuous, designed to be mistaken for a veterinary tag if noticed. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of what was being asked, his demeanor more focused than previous missions, perhaps responding to the tension all humans were radiating. Antoine and Ghost moved through ruins that felt more dangerous than the previous journey, evidence of German presence visible everywhere. Equipment staged for continued operations, soldiers sleeping in protected positions, vehicles parked in configurations that blocked potential escape routes. Ghost navigated around these obstacles with the skill that had kept him alive in occupied territory, and Antoine followed, trusting the dog's instincts about where danger lay. They reached the release point without incident, and Antoine watched Ghost disappear into darkness with the message that might represent their last communication with the outside resistance. Whether the dog would return, whether the bookstore owner would respond, whether any of this desperate improvisation would produce results that mattered, those questions had no answers, except waiting for outcomes that were beyond their control. Ghost returned at dawn with no message pouch, but his arrival coincided with something the cell hadn't expected: a lull in German search operations. The systematic sweeps that had been ongoing for 18 hours suddenly paused, soldiers withdrawing to command posts, vehicles repositioning in ways that suggested operational shift rather than continued clearing. Marie observed the change through binoculars with the confusion of someone who'd expected relentless pressure, but was seeing something that looked like partial withdrawal. The explanation arrived 2 hours later when Antoine spotted a French civilian approaching their district, under German escort. Not the threatening escort of someone being interrogated, but the protective accompaniment of someone valuable to occupation authorities. Through binoculars, Marcel recognized the bookstore owner, walking with Gestapo officers toward a location approximately 2 blocks from their position. The implications were immediately and terrifyingly clear. Either the bookstore owner had been captured and was being used to identify resistance locations, or he'd been an informant all along and was now helping Germans locate the cell that had trusted him with their survival. Ghost's reaction provided the answer they needed. The dog showed no interest in the approaching civilian, no recognition response that would indicate this was someone he'd delivered messages to. Either Ghost hadn't actually reached the bookstore during his courier runs, or the person they'd thought was the bookstore owner was someone else entirely. The resistance cell had been operating on compromised intelligence, sending messages to what they believed was a safe contact, but might have been feeding information directly to Gestapo counterintelligence. Marcel made the assessment that their position was about to be compromised, regardless of whether they'd been deliberately betrayed or accidentally exposed. They had perhaps 30 minutes before German forces reached their hiding place. Not enough time for elaborate escape planning, but sufficient for the desperate breakout that was now their only option. The 7 members of the Renard cell prepared to abandon the concealment that had protected them for weeks, knowing that movement in daylight through German-occupied territory would likely result in casualties they couldn't afford, but couldn't avoid. Sophie had a different proposal, delivered with the quiet urgency of someone who'd been thinking through alternatives, while others focused on immediate threats. Ghost knows routes through these ruins that we don't. He's navigated German lines successfully multiple times. If we follow him instead of trying to plan our own escape route, we might have better chance of avoiding patrols and checkpoints. It was unconventional to the point of absurdity, letting a dog determine tactical movement for trained resistance fighters. But their conventional approaches had led them to this moment of near-certain capture. They followed Ghost's lead because they had no better options, and because the dog had proven more reliable than human intelligence networks that had been penetrated by informants. The route Ghost chose didn't follow any path the cell would have selected. It went through sections of ruins they'd considered impassable, required crawling through spaces barely large enough for humans, and seemed to deliberately avoid the most obvious escape corridors. But it also avoided every German position they could observe, navigating with precision that suggested Ghost understood occupation force deployment better than the resistance fighters who'd been studying those patterns for months. The escape took 4 hours of continuous movement, with German forces visible at multiple points, but never close enough to detect the 7 people and 1 dog moving through rubble with the silence that meant survival. They emerged in a sector the Germans had cleared days earlier and apparently considered secured, which made it the last place occupation forces would expect to find resistance members. A pre-arranged safe house in this sector provided temporary refuge while the cell assessed their situation and attempted to make contact with resistance networks that might still be functional. The bookstore owner was never identified with certainty, whether he was legitimate contact who'd been compromised, informant who'd been manipulating them from the beginning, or completely uninvolved civilian whom Germans were using for misdirection, remained unclear. What was clear was that Ghost's instincts had guided them away from capture when human planning would have led them directly into Gestapo hands. The dog had become more than courier or scout. He'd become the core tactical asset that enabled their survival when every conventional resistance method had failed. Ghost remained with the cell through the remaining months of occupation, participating in operations that relied increasingly on his ability to navigate urban environments where German security made human movement nearly impossible. His reputation spread through resistance networks, and other cells began attempting to replicate the success by training dogs for courier and reconnaissance work. The methodology was never formalized into doctrine. Improvisation under extreme pressure rarely produced repeatable procedures. But Ghost's example proved that unconventional approaches could succeed where conventional resistance methods encountered obstacles that seemed insurmountable. When liberation came in 1944, Sophie adopted Ghost through the informal arrangements that characterized most human-animal partnerships formed during occupation. They remained together through the difficult post-war years, Ghost adapting to peacetime with the same competence he'd shown during operations when detection meant death. He lived to be 13 years old, his later years peaceful in ways the occupation years had never been. When he died in 1954, Sophie buried him in the ruins of the Saint-Michel district where they'd first encountered each other, marking the spot with a simple stone that read, "Ghost, Resistance Courier. He found paths we couldn't see." The 7 members of the Renard cell survived the war, though their paths diverged in the chaos of liberation and reconstruction. They gathered occasionally for reunions where Ghost's contributions were always mentioned with the reverence that authentic survival stories earned. Whether the dog had understood what he was doing, whether his successes were intelligence or instinct, remained debatable. What wasn't debatable was that a stray shepherd navigating ruined streets had enabled a resistance cell to survive when every probability suggested they should have been captured, interrogated, and executed like so many others who fought occupation from the shadows. If Ghost's story moved you, if it revealed something about the unexpected partnerships that emerged during humanity's darkest hours, share it with others who value authentic resistance history that honors all who contributed to liberation, including those who walked on 4 legs and answered to no flag. Subscribe to continue exploring the untold stories from occupied Europe. Stories that remind us courage appears in forms we don't always expect, and that sometimes the most important intelligence comes from sources military doctrine never anticipated. Comment with your reflections on working animals in resistance operations, and remember that history contains thousands of small acts that changed outcomes in ways official records never captured. Ghost was one of those small acts that mattered more than anyone predicted.